Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAM for short.
I'm really delighted to welcome everyone to this webinar, and particularly delighted to welcome David Trickey, who's going to be our speaker today. You've seen in the publicity which we had on the website that David is the co-director of the UK Trauma Council and a consultant clinical psychologist. And he's particularly interested to think about how children and young people can adapt to bereavement and to trauma, and bringing these two elements together of traumatic bereavement is a very significant and important and interesting theme. Delighted to see on the chat that we have many bereavement counsellors and folk working in hospices in those contexts, and I'm sure today will be of very considerable interest to you and to all of us. I want to particularly thank David for his generosity and sharing, and in the guides which we've spoken about at other ACAM events, he has contributed some wonderful material, and I think he may well refer to some of it today. And it's really it's been extremely popular and has been translated into Russian, into Arabic, into Romanian and Spanish. So your work speaks loudly, David. So the theme today, David's seminar, is aimed to help practitioners to more effectively identify and help children and young people presenting with a traumatic bereavement. And of course, during the pandemic, there has been additional challenges for young people, and we're all aware of the exponential rise in mental health responses of children and young people, and bereavement and loss must play an important role in the factors which have had such an adverse impact on children and young people's health and well-being. And of course, the sudden nature of a death, not being able to say goodbye, and the constraints, and we all know the constraints during the pandemic and the inability of people to be able to connect and to share and to grieve and to work through these important issues. So the whole issues of the constraints on mourning in line with normal practices, and the elements that come together to make for a highly traumatic context. And as David says in his introduction, thinking about traumatic bereavement requires us to consider both trauma and bereavement. Trauma, the way that distressing events may be so extreme or intense that they give rise to a toxic stress response, overwhelm the ability to cope, and have a very negative impact with all the responses which we're beginning to be so familiar with. With a traumatic bereavement, they face having to cope with both the trauma, the death, and the grief that follows the loss. And David makes the interesting point, which I'm sure he'll build on, is that trauma can disrupt grieving processes, making it even harder to grieve, important implications. So that we're really very grateful to David for having agreed to come and present this material. When I saw the publication on the website of the UK Trauma Council, I thought we really must have David come and speak about this theme to our ACEs seminar, as it's such an important element. Because I think when we think about adverse childhood experiences, we're now in a phase where we have a much broader understanding of these issues beyond the basic that we have all been familiar with from Feliti's work of the basic forms of maltreatment and household stressors. And we're now aware of the extensiveness and extreme adversity to which children and young people are exposed to. And I have asked ACAM to put the latest of the ACAM newsletters to make that available, because a very recent development from the UK Trauma Council, which David has developed on helping schools deal with extreme events, suicide, death, loss, and how to help within schools, is another element, another facet of this important work which David is pioneering on trauma and grief and loss. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome you, David, to thank you very much. And hopefully it's been helpful that people have identified themselves on the chat. Please put your questions in the question and answer box, and we will try to ensure that there's an opportunity for some interchange between us. Not so easy with the webinar because, of course, cameras and sound is off, but we can have a lively interchange through the messages that you give and the questions that you ask. So could I ask you, David, if you would now make your presentation? Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Arnon, for that lovely and slightly grand introduction. I hope you haven't over exaggerated too much. I don't want to. I want to manage people's expectations. So I'm now going to share my screen, and I still get angry, but I still worry that I'm about to share my wrong screen, and that you'll all see I've been listening to Barry Manilow this afternoon. So I'm hoping you can see a screen with some slides. So yeah, thank you, Arnon, for that lovely introduction. I've been a big fan of ACAM for decades, literally decades. I've been a member, and I've always been so impressed with the work that ACAM does and the resources it provides for those of us who are sort of busy practitioners and clinicians. So I'm just really delighted to be here. And thank you everyone for making the time out of your busy schedules. I really hope that we can provide something that's going to be useful, and do use the Q&A chat function. You know, it'd be really lovely to have a bit of a dialogue and to see if we can mull over some of the questions that you may have. So please do keep those questions coming as we go along. So you heard a little bit about the UK Trauma Council, which is a project here at the Anna Freud Centre, where I am at the moment, where we try to help those directly working with traumatized children, young people and families. And we do that by helping those around them, such as the social workers, the therapists, the practitioners, the support workers, whoever it is that is providing that environment. And we do that by providing resources and information and guidance, very much based on the research evidence. We draw on a group of UK trauma experts, and we very much create our resources in conjunction with the children and young people, but also with the intended audience. We have lots of different resources. I'm not going to spend too much time going through them all, but there's just two that I would draw your attention to. One is the Childhood Trauma and the Brain, which is a fantastic suite of resources. And I can show off about these because I had nothing to do with their production at all. It was colleagues that put them together, but it really shows how children's brains adapt to their environments. And then when they're no longer in those traumatic and traumatizing environments, sometimes those adaptations are no longer helpful. And there's lots of different guidance there for those of us who are practitioners. I'm really a therapist. That's how I spend most of my time. And the one that's probably more relevant for us here today is our suite of resources on traumatic bereavement. And again, we have an animation there, which you might be interested to look at later on. A guide for schools. We see schools as playing a fundamental and vital role in children's lives, and also a guide for clinicians to give them some ideas about what it is when it's a traumatic bereavement. And obviously that's the focus of our discussion this afternoon, this evening. Language is really important. It's also quite complicated because it changes and it means different things to different people at different times. So I would just like to preface everything I'm about to say that I have thought carefully about the language I use, but I don't always get it right. And if I say anything that is in any way discriminatory or offensive or difficult, then please do let me know, and I'll try and do better next time. And the last thing to say before I really get on with some work for you is, I don't know about your past. I don't know what you're going through at the moment or what your loved ones are going through, but I do know that I'm going to be talking about trauma and children and bereavement. And as nice people, as compassionate human beings, we should be moved by these stories. They should have an impact on us. But if for whatever reason you feel a bit more than you would normally, maybe you start to feel a bit overwhelmed, please do take responsibility for looking after yourself. So that might mean that you need to take a break and step away for a bit. It might mean you want to talk it through with someone at the end of this session. Sometimes I find it really useful to write stuff down, and that really helps me to put it to one side. Or maybe now's not the right time to be listening to these sorts of stories. So please do take responsibility for looking after yourself. And I have to say that I often find I'm more affected in an event like this rather than when I'm doing the clinical work. I'm ready to hear the stories when I'm doing clinical work. My expectations being managed. And then sometimes if I'm reading an article or I'm on a training course, I'm not quite expecting to be moved quite so much. So I mean, the last time I cried was reading a research article. It was about some unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. And, I was expecting to hear 60% of the children experience that, 20% had experienced that. But actually, it went into quite a lot of detail about some of their stories, and it really upset me. So please do take responsibility for looking after yourself. And what I'm going to try and do over the course of the next hour or so is think about how traumatic events affect children and young people, what helps that adjustment following a bereavement, and then what happens when those two things collide, when you have trauma and bereavement together. And also then, very importantly, what helps with recovery? What is it that helps people to get through some of these difficulties? So let's start thinking just about trauma, first of all. Now, what makes a potentially traumatic event actually traumatic? And I think there's a very useful model that can help us here. It's called the cognitive model of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the story goes, because the model is just a story, the story goes that if you're traumatized by an event, it's either because of the way the memories of that event are stored or because of the meanings that you give to those events. Or it might be both. Those two things might come together. And then the difficulties are often maintained, usually by a process of avoidance. And what I'd like to do is just explain this in a bit more detail. Have you ever had that experience where you're walking along the road and a memory just falls into mind? You didn't fetch it on purpose, but something triggered it and suddenly you've remembered something. Many of us have had that experience, but most of us don't have it most of the time because it would be chaos if these memories just get flooding our consciousness. So we seem to have developed a preference for keeping those memories at bay. When we want them, we bring them into mind. When we're finished with them, we put them back. So if I asked you about the last time you went to the cinema, you would locate your cinema memory, bring it into consciousness, tell us the story of going to the cinema. And as long as my next slide is interesting enough, you then put that memory back. Professor Bruin and colleagues would call these contextualized representations, or CREPs. They're just memories for normal events. I was explaining this to a 14-year-old many years ago, and I'm very lucky. I work with some very patient 14-year-olds, and I was talking about evolution. And I said, if you're running away from a dinosaur and you just keep remembering everything, you're going to get eaten. You'd be running away and you'd be thinking, oh, do you remember that game of football we had down there? And, oh, do you remember that picnic we had up on the hill? Those people would get eaten. The people that could put their memories to one side and run would be the people that survive and have children with similar sorts of brains. This was my explanation of evolution. And this 14-year-old, she encouraged me with this story. She went, okay, David, right. And I got to the end of my story and she said, that's an interesting story, but I have two problems with it. The first is that humans and dinosaurs didn't exist at the same time, which I have to say was news to me. And she said, and anyway, I believe that God made us like this. And I said, well, didn't you do a good job? Because whatever story you have to explain it, broadly speaking, we know that these memories stay put. And we know quite a lot about these memories, these normal event memories. We know that they consist of words and stories. So when I tell you about that 14-year-old, I don't remember the data. I don't remember what she looked like, the sound of her voice, what room we were in, what time of year it was. What I remember is the narrative. And normal event memories are pretty coherent and complete. They sort of make sense. They stay put until deliberately recalled. So I don't think about that story unless I deliberately bring it to mind to tell you. I know roughly where and when it happened. It was back there and back then. Memories are not particularly reliable. They sometimes change over time. And the original emotions will often fade. They tend to be linked to other memories, and we can generally tolerate or welcome memories for normal events. But at times of extreme horror or terror or helplessness or shame or pain or disgust, are those moments we're in a different mode. And as a result, memories get laid down in a different way. So they're stored as the actual vivid data of the event, the sights, the smells, the tastes, the touches, the thoughts, the feelings. The memories are often fragmented, so they're not that coherent narrative. You have this moment and that moment, and they don't all join up. Traumatic memories or memories for traumatic events tend to be very easily triggered. They fall into consciousness incredibly easily. When they come back to mind, it feels as if they're happening again in the here and now. So they don't have the time tag. We don't know it was back then. It feels as if it's right here, right now. They tend to be locked in, so they don't often change over time, and the original distress will come with it, even years later. They tend to be isolated from other memories, and understandably, they tend to be avoided. Now, memories for difficult events might start off more like that, but as we process them, as we think them through, as we tell those stories, they actually change format and they become more like the normal memories. So there's traumatic event memories, which some people might call sensory bound representations or SREPs. They fall into consciousness. That's really unpleasant, so we push them away. And as a result, we don't get to process them in the same way as other events. And people then get stuck in this avoidance trap. So this unprocessed memory falls into consciousness, maybe through flashbacks or nightmares or just thoughts, bringing with it the original fear or horror or helplessness. And that's unpleasant, so people try not to think about it. And because they try not to think about it, they don't get to process the memory and change the format. But also that very act of avoidance triggers the memory. So the very thing you're trying not to think about, by trying not to think about it, you actually end up thinking about it. One boy said to me, it's like a boomerang. The harder I throw it away, the harder it comes back and hits me. People also try to avoid triggers because these memories are so volatile and so easily triggered, and that's really unpleasant. They go out of their way to avoid perhaps going back to that place, or perhaps getting into a relationship, or perhaps trusting someone. And then because they avoid it, they don't get to process it. They don't get to think through, well, last time I was here, this happened and this happened and this happened. And again, that active decision to avoid a road or to avoid a person ends up triggering the thing that you don't want to be thinking about. So that avoidance backfires. Now, I wouldn't want you to think that Professor Bruin discovered or invented these two different ways of, these two different memory formats. Pierre Janet, more than 100 years ago, was talking about the same phenomena. Janet was contemporary of Freud's. He just didn't catch on in quite the same way as Freud did. He was a bit like the Betamax to Freud's VHS, if you like. And he talked about having fixed ideas of traumatic events, and people can't make the recital, they can't tell the story, and yet they remain confronted by it as they try to adjust. It seems that most presentations have a brain scan in them at some point these days, so I didn't want to be any different. So here's a brain scan, and I think this was an interesting experiment. It's done quite a while ago now. They got adults with post-traumatic stress disorder. They put them into the enclosed space of a brain scanner on their own and deliberately triggered the traumatic memories that gave them their current PTSD. And an ethics committee said, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. Let's see what happens. And what happened was, whilst they're lying in the brain scanner and the researcher is triggering different memories, different parts of the brain are activated. And then they could see which parts of the brain were only activated by the neutral memories and which parts of the brain are only activated by trauma memories. And what they found was that Broca's area, one of the language centers of the brain, is only activated by a neutral memory, but not by a trauma memory. So they'd be lying in the brain scanner, and the researcher would be saying, do you remember the time you went to the cinema? Broca's area comes online. Do you remember the time you went shopping? Broca's area comes online. Do you remember the time you were sexually assaulted? Broca's area doesn't come online. So when we talk about some events being too terrible for words, in some ways that's what this brain scan shows. And then when they flip it around the other way, they found lots of parts of the brain are only activated by the trauma memories. And in particular, the amygdala, which is, if you like, the alarm center of the brain, that was only activated by the trauma memories. So this really supports the idea that we have these two types of memory, the two different memory systems at play here. Now, you don't have to have been there to be traumatized by an event, and I've deliberately blurred this picture out. It was a picture drawn by a 9-year-old of the death of her brother. She wasn't there, she didn't see it, she didn't see a video of it. In fact, no one told her exactly what happened, but she created an image that represented that event, and it behaved just like a trauma memory. It would intrude into her consciousness. When she was trying to go to sleep, that's what she could see. When she did get to sleep, that would be the image that woke her up. When she went to her brother's funeral, this is the thing that she was thinking about. And when we showed the picture to the mother, Mum got very upset because, in fact, it was an incredibly accurate depiction of what had happened. She had overheard snippets of conversations and created this image. So what we did in that case was we helped Mum to tell the story to this 9-year-old. And once she delivered the story, these images stopped. So I'm not saying that everything was fine, but she was then able to get on with the grieving the loss of her brother because the event of his death wasn't the thing that was stalling that process. How do we explain this to children, young people and families? Well, we have a number of stories. The first one is about a chocolate factory. Now, a chocolate factory takes the different ingredients, the milk, the sugar, the cocoa, it mixes them up and creates a chocolate bar and then puts a wrapper around it. And on the wrapper, you have words on the outside that tells you about what's on the inside. It says ingredients and lists the ingredients. And in some ways, our minds are similar. We take the different elements of an event, we create a memory, and then we wrap it up with a narrative. So you have words on the outside that tells you about the contents. Now, with a chocolate factory, if the sugar is not ground down enough, or if the milk is too hot, then the machinery can't cope with those ingredients. And as a result, it grinds to a halt and you end up with ingredients swirling around on the factory floor. And in some ways, our minds are similar. If an event is overwhelming, is too much for us to cope with, we can't process it in the same way. And as a result, the ingredients, the elements of that event end up swirling around in our minds. So with a chocolate factory, you might get someone in to help. You might wait until the milk has cooled down. You might take the sugar and grind it down into smaller pieces, and then you can start to process those ingredients and create chocolate bars. And similarly with our minds and with traumatic events, you might get someone in to help you. You might just wait until it's less frightening and you can think it through, or you might need to take those events and break them down into smaller pieces so you can start to process what happened. We have another couple of stories. One is about a wardrobe. If you imagine a wardrobe, you have all your clothes put away. When you need them, you take them out, you wear them, you wash them, very occasionally iron them, then you put them back and you can close the doors and they all stay put. And similarly, we have our different memories tucked away. When we need them, we bring them into mind. When we're finished with them, we put them back. And much of the time, they stay put. With the wardrobe, if somebody threw you a duvet and it was full of stinging nettles and it hurt to hold on to, and they said, put it away quick, and you shove it in the wardrobe and close the door, but it's not put away properly. So it keeps bulging out, and you might be able to keep it there if you keep your hand on the cupboard door, but when you take your hand off, it falls out and hurts you again, and you throw it back in there. And similarly, if you experience traumatic events, you don't want to be thinking about that. So you try hard to shove it in the back of your mind. And if you keep yourself busy enough doing something else, then it might stay put. But perhaps between going to bed and going to sleep, it'll fall back into your mind and it will hurt you again. And that's horrible, so you push it away again. So with the wardrobe and the duvet, you might get someone to help. You need to take hold of that, which might be painful. Fold it up neatly. You might have to move things around on the shelves, but then you can put it away and then it will stay put. And similarly with traumatic events, you might get someone to help you. You need to take hold of those events on purpose and think them through. You might have to adjust your view of the world, but then you can put them away and they'll stay put. I was explaining this to another very patient 14-year-old I was working with. He'd come from Kosovo, he had a long history of trauma. And I was explaining why we were going to do some more trauma-focused work, or why I was going to suggest it. And I started telling him these stories, and he said, it's a bit like that, David, but actually it's more like this. And he got the waste paper bin and he put it on the desk and he filled it up with scrunched up pieces of paper. He said, these are all the bad things that have happened to me. And as I walked to school, they fall in front of my eyes. And when I lie down and go to sleep, they fall into my dreams. But when I come to see you, we take them out of the bin and we unscrunch them. Then we read them through carefully and we fold them up neatly and we put them back in the bin. But because they're folded up neatly, it means they don't fall out the top, and I've got more room in my head to think about other things. And I sat there with my pen going, what's that last bit about? More room in your head? And then more recently, I was working with a younger boy who'd experienced an awful event, and it kept re-feeling what had happened. So he kept having these very vivid sensations of the event. And he really wanted them to stop, and he really didn't want to talk about what had happened. I wasn't going to make him talk about it. I didn't even want to put him under any pressure. But I did want to sow the seed of the idea that at some point, with somebody, it might be useful to bring it to mind on purpose. So I started telling him these stories, and halfway through one of them, he closed his eyes, he put his hands up to his head. I said, are you okay? He said, yeah. He said, I think I've got it. Is it like this? On my laptop, I've got loads of JPEG files. They're massive files. Some of them are corrupted, and they keep making my hard drive crash. Are you saying if I take the JPEGs of what happened to me and I write them out and I save them as a Word document, they'll take up less room on my hard drive and stop making it crash? I said, yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. Changing the format of the file. We're not deleting it, but we're changing the format so that it behaves in a different way. So that's the memory bit of the story. And then the meaning bit of the story is to do with our beliefs about ourselves, the world, and other people. Generally speaking, we have certain assumptions about the way things are supposed to work. They're often unconscious. We take them for granted. So I believe the ground will hold my weight. I don't step out tentatively. I just confidently stride out. And sure enough, it holds my weight. And that's a good assumption for getting on in life. And those assumptions, those beliefs, are a bit like a lens through which we see the world. So it colors the way we see things. It makes us have different thoughts about what's going on. It makes us have different feelings and makes us act in a certain way. And the way that we perceive things will usually strengthen our beliefs, because it's easier to make something fit with our beliefs than it is to change our expectations. So that lens can act as a filters out things that don't fit. It can distort things so that they do fit. I noticed that many of you here today are from Ireland. I was very lucky. I was in Dublin a couple of weeks ago. Now, if I believed that Dublin was very friendly and London was very unfriendly, I'm not saying that's what I believe, but just if I did believe that, then I might start to notice all the lovely, friendly people in Ireland, and particularly in Dublin. And that then confirms my beliefs. I might start to notice all the headlines of things that happen in London, or see people that are not being friendly in London, and that confirms my beliefs. So that filter is actually biasing the information that I'm taking in. I don't notice the lovely, friendly people in London, for example. Or then I might even act in a way that confirms those beliefs. So I buy a coffee just before I get on the plane to Dublin. And because I'm in London, I don't talk to the person selling me a coffee. I don't speak to them. They don't speak to me. And it confirms my beliefs. I get off the plane in Dublin. And because I'm now in Dublin, I talk to the taxi driver. And because I talk to them, they talk to me back. And we have a lovely old chat on the way to the hotel. And I get out the taxi thinking, I'm so glad to be here in Dublin. So my actions have elicited behavior in others that have confirmed my beliefs. Now, if something doesn't fit, I might ignore it, so I don't notice the exceptions. I might distort it. So I bump into someone in London and they're really friendly. And I think to myself, is that an Irish accent I can hear? So I find some way to distort things so that it maintains my beliefs, because that's easier than changing my beliefs every time something comes along that doesn't fit. And all of that meaning making takes place within different layers of systems. So things like family, schools, peer groups, communities, and sometimes agencies as well. But what happens if an event comes along that doesn't fit with our beliefs? It's too big to distort, too big to ignore. Well, then our beliefs do give way. And in fact, that event colors the way that we see things. And even when that event has passed, we're left with a different view of the world, ourselves, and others. And that leads to different sorts of thoughts and different sorts of feelings and different sorts of actions. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute of how this works in practice. And then often again, it's actually our behavior that will confirm those beliefs, often through a process of avoidance. I work with Envoy. I'm going to call him Joe. He was 8 years old, and we were talking about what had happened. And he said, "The trouble is, David, the rules have been broken." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we were on the pavement. If we were in the middle of the road, fair enough, but we were on the pavement and we should have been safe." He said, "So that rule's gone." I said, "Yeah, that's true." I said, "You said rules, so what other rules have been broken?" He said, "Well, I used to think this stuff happened to other families." He said, "You'd hear it on the news, you'd be sad for a bit, then you'd get on with your tea." He said, "But it's happened to us." I said, "Right. Are there any other rules that have been broken?" He said, "Yeah, I used to think that we'd had our share of bad luck." So he has some physical health problems. He said, "I thought that was our family's share of bad luck, but we've had more than our fair share of bad luck." And then because I like this idea of a lens, I said to him, these rules you have, are they a bit like a lens that sort of colors the way you see things? And he said, "No." He said, "What are you talking about with a lens?" He said, "They're rules. Didn't you go to school? When you go to school, you have rules and people are supposed to stick to them, and they didn't." So the lens thing doesn't always work, it turns out. What about if it's multiple events? It's not just a one-off single event. Well, I still think this model, this story is useful because you have these different events come along and maybe gradually change your view of yourself, the world, and others. And when they stop, you're left with a different view of things. What I'd like to do is bring all of those ideas together and just explain how they work. And I'm going to use a few examples to do that. So John was a boy I worked with who had quite a long history of domestic violence. His stepfather used to regularly assault his mother, occasionally assault John or his sister. And that repeated domestic violence changed his thinking. It made him believe that he was vulnerable. It made him believe that the world was dangerous and that people are violent. And when eventually mum was able to leave, the stepdad, John was left with these views of things. One day he was in the classroom and the teacher raised his voice above the hubbub of the class. And he looked at John as he said, "Come on, settle down." And he was walking towards John and he had his finger raised. So a very natural kind of teacherly thing to do. But because he caught John's eye, given John's history, he saw this angry adult male walking towards him. And he thought, I know what happens when angry adult males walk towards me. And he had what some people might describe an amygdala hijack. And he lashed out and attacked the teacher. And this teacher was somewhat surprised to be attacked by this 16-year-old, sort of wrestled him off, tried to get him off him, which John then interpreted as, "See, I said he was going to attack me." So that whole thing just confirmed John's idea. But when I was working with John, he was able to tell me that sometimes there was something about that teacher that would remind him of his stepdad. He said it was something about the way he lifted his eyebrow. And this memory would flood his consciousness and remind him of how dangerous the world was and how vulnerable he was. So we end up with the memory and the meaning working together to keep people on this high state of alert. Anna was a girl I worked with whose father had killed her mother. And quite a lot of my work has been with children where one parent has killed the other. And the first time I met her, she said, "Well, it's my fault." I said, "That's a really interesting idea. Tell me more." She said, "Well, I gave Dad the key, the front door key, which meant he could get into the house and kill my mum. If I hadn't given him the key, then he wouldn't have killed her and she'd be alive today." I said, "That's a really interesting idea. Have you ever told anyone else that's what you think?" She said, "I used to tell other people that's what I thought, but they told me I was stupid for thinking that and that I should stop it." I said, "Oh, did you stop thinking that?" She said, "No, I just stopped telling people that's what I was thinking." So I had these conversations with her around this guilt and how that would work. And I was just very validating and very curious. I said, "Well, let me see if I've got this right." And we would write it out. Is that what's going on? I didn't challenge her. My experience with adolescents is if you challenge their thinking too strongly, what you get is a robust defense. They cling to their ideas even more tightly. And what we want them to do is to loosen their grip. So I was just very validating and very curious. And over about 8 weeks, her story changed. It went from, if I hadn't given him the key, he wouldn't have killed her, to if I hadn't given him the key, he wouldn't have killed her that night, but he would have killed her another night. And as a result, her guilt went from this to this. So this is, sorry, I didn't keep up with myself with those slides, but this really just tells that same story. Now, Winnie the Pooh says, a thing when it's inside your head seems very thingish, but when it's outside of your head, has other people looking at it, it doesn't seem so thingish anymore. And that's really what we did. It was Winnie the Pooh therapy. So she has this idea in her head, it's my fault, I can't believe I gave him the key, that's awful. And she would push it away. She didn't have the opportunity to recalibrate her responsibility because it was such an horrendous idea, it was her fault, she would discard it. And then it would come back and she'd push it away. But through the process of having someone that she could trust, someone who was just curious, didn't tell her how to think, she was able to get these ideas out of her head onto the paper and in the space between us. And as a result, they started to change. Ahmet was a boy I worked with fairly recently who'd had a number of family members be really ill with coronavirus, and his grandfather died. And he developed a set of beliefs about the world being dangerous. And let's face it, for many years, the world was dangerous. And our governments and the media were very keen to give us this message, how dangerous the world is. He started to believe that he was vulnerable. He wasn't sure he could trust others. There was some sense of in the story that maybe the doctors hadn't quite done what they could have done to save his granddad. In fact, this was very early on in the pandemic, and people were still learning about what would work. So after his grandfather had died, this is the view of things that Ahmet was left with. And when the schools here in England opened up and the pupils were returning, he would see that return through that lens. And as a result, he would think, well, I'll get it. If I go to school, I'll get it. I'll infect other people and they might die, or I might die. So obviously he was incredibly anxious. And the easiest way to get rid of that anxiety is to stay in. In fact, he stayed in his room most of the time. So he avoided going to school, he avoided his friends, he became increasingly isolated. And in fact, that just maintained his unbalanced beliefs. He said to me, the only reason I've not got it is because I've stayed in all the time. And he had a number of traumatic memories that would intrude into his consciousness to remind him of how dangerous the world was. So one of his memories was the feet of the paramedics going up the stairs to Granddad's bedroom. He also had some imagined images of how his granddad had died. And these really haunted him, actually. And it just kept this idea alive of how dangerous the world was. So again, here we see the traumatic nature of the death getting in the way of him grieving his loss. Because every time he tries to think about granddad, actually what he remembers is granddad's death. What I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. Not because I think it's crucial to make a diagnosis or not, but I think it's a useful framework to think about how people react to trauma. And once we define something, we can sort of study it and understand it a bit better. I think there are risks of diagnoses, generally speaking. If we're not careful, they can pathologize or stigmatize what's actually a natural and understandable reaction. Some people, it just doesn't fit with their culture. Maybe it unhelpfully reduces things to yes or no. Sometimes people end up thinking, well, I haven't got a diagnosis, so have I really got a problem? And some people will cling to an old, outdated diagnosis that actually is no longer relevant or truthful or useful. And if we're not careful, it reduces curiosity and options. But actually, I think if we use diagnoses, or if other colleagues use them carefully, they can provide a nice definition of the problem, which actually makes it very easy to communicate. But also, it provides an explanation. It's a thing. PTSD is a thing. If I go to my GP, my doctor, and I've got some strange symptoms, if they tell me what it's called, I'm immediately relieved, even if it's in Latin. Knowing that it's a thing is really reassuring. And actually, PTSD can help people to understand that they've got these intrusive images. I can't get rid of them. I keep trying not to, but that doesn't work. I can't sleep. What's going on? We've got PTSD. And they go, oh, it's a thing. That's what I've got. If nothing else, it provides a framework for assessment, I think, and sometimes it enables access to better services. So bearing in mind that it's not necessarily everyone's role to make a diagnosis or not, I'm going to just tell you what PTSD looks like. So of course it has to be an exposure to a potentially traumatic event. And then there has to be some form of intrusion where the memory is intruding into consciousness or seeping into their everyday life. So children, young people, maybe they play out themes of the event in their play, or they suddenly freeze when something reminds them of it. They have to be avoiding either thoughts or feelings or memories, or avoiding things on the outside like people, places, conversations, activities. Then there's quite a broad group of difficulties to do with thoughts and feelings or cognitions and mood. Maybe they can't remember big chunks of what happened. Maybe they now see the world with these exaggerated negative ideas. They may think that it's their fault. They may have distorted thoughts about what actually happened. Sometimes they get stuck in one emotional gear. So constantly angry, constantly guilty. They may start to withdraw and have less interest in things they used to enjoy. They may feel detached, or they may just be numb, completely emotionally numb. I'm just going to cough, so I'm going to go on mute for a moment. Excuse me. Then we have a group of difficulties to do with arousal and reactivity. They may be more irritable because they're now operating on a higher level of arousal, so it takes less to push them over the edge. They may start to engage in reckless behavior. They may be hypervigilant, always on the lookout for the next bad thing. If something makes them jump, they really jump, and they stay jumped for longer. They may find it difficult to concentrate, and of course, they find it difficult to sleep because their body is now keeping them on this high level of arousal. I've put some kitchen scales up there as the icon because if you have kitchen scales, they're at 0. You put a weight on, they go up. You take the weight off, and they go back to 0. We have a sort of a resting arousal level. Something stressful comes along, like you deliver a webinar for ACAM to hundreds of people, and my watch has been telling me that I'm stressed. Just before we started, my watch was saying, it looks like you need to relax. So I have this level of arousal going on because I have this sorry, but this is a little bit stressful for me talking to you all. And that probably helps me to kind of be a bit more sharp and a bit more on it. Now, when this is finished, as I'm walking down to the station later on, I will go back to my resting level of arousal, just as the kitchen scales go back to 0. If you put a weight on the kitchen scales that is too heavy, when you take the weight off, it doesn't go back to 0. And if you experience an event that is traumatic rather than stressful, you may find it difficult to go back to your resting level of arousal. So as a result, you stay on this higher level. For PTSD, it has to have gone on for at least a month, or we don't call it PTSD. That's really important because actually those sorts of reactions are really common. Most of us would have those sorts of reactions following a potentially traumatic event, but for many of us, they would diminish over the following weeks and months. And they have to be causing a problem. They have to be causing you clinically significant distress or impairment. So that's what PTSD looks like. And once we've defined it, we can then study it and see what happens. And I just want to tell you a bit about a few studies which I think give us quite important messages about post-traumatic stress disorder and the reactions to trauma more generally. So this is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is just a very fancy average done by a researcher who's too lazy to gather their own data. So they've gone and harvested other people's data, squashed it together in a very sophisticated, fancy average, and then produced a paper. And this particular one is done by a colleague and friend of mine, Rachel Hiller. And she looked at how many young people have PTSD after potentially traumatic events. And she was able to find 18 good studies. And what she found was that over time, this comes down. So if you look at here, 1 month, more than 20% of children and young people would fulfill criteria for PTSD, but it comes down over the subsequent months, but it levels off at around 6 months on average. So what this means to me is that if you've got PTSD and it's 6 months later, it's probably not going to get better by itself. You may need to do something different or get some additional support in order to have that spontaneous recovery. So we get quite a lot of spontaneous recovery in those first 6 months, and then it levels off. So if I'm working with a young person a year after a traumatic event, if they say, well, I don't really want to do the intervention with you, I think it'll just get better on its own. I say, yeah, well, it might do, but let me just show you this graph. I want them to understand the things that we understand about PTSD. I'm very much a therapist. I'm not an academic, but I wanted to try and beef up my academic CV. And I thought, how hard can a meta-analysis of risk factors be? Which children are most likely to get PTSD? It turns out meta-analyses are really hard. I had to get a grown-up to help me with the sums, then I had to get another grown-up to help me understand what on earth they meant. And what we found was that the things that happen before an event, on average, based on more than 100 studies, make a small difference to whether you get PTSD or not. So if you've got a history of previous difficulties psychologically or a history of traumatic events, you're a bit more likely to get PTSD. The things at the actual time of the trauma make a bigger difference. So how severe was the event? How bad was it? Trauma severity. That, of course, makes a difference. But to me, what's really interesting is this gap here between trauma severity and peri-traumatic fear, were you afraid at the time and did you think you were going to die? Those two things are bigger risk factors than trauma severity. And trauma severity is how big or bad the researcher thinks the event was. Peri-traumatic fear and perceived life threat are how big or bad the young person thinks it was. And those are bigger predictors of PTSD. So it matters more what the young person thinks than what the researchers think. And the good news for us, because not many of us are involved in preventing the trauma, but the good news is that the things that come after the event are even bigger predictors of PTSD. And there are things we can do with some of this. There are ways we can intervene to reduce these risk factors. So how well is your parent doing? Does your parent have a psychological problem like depression or anxiety or PTSD? Is the same size risk factor as trauma severity. It matters as much how well your carer is doing as what actually happened to you. Low social support and social withdrawal are becoming bigger and bigger risk factors. So children who are isolating themselves or who are being estranged from their friends are much more likely to have PTSD. Families that are not working well together, that's a risk factor for PTSD. And distraction. So deliberately thinking about something else to avoid thinking about a traumatic event is a pretty big risk factor for PTSD. So that's a sort of a whistle-stop tour of trauma, thinking particularly about PTSD, but I'm not in any way suggesting that's the only or even the most common reaction to trauma. I think that it's a useful framework, though. Now let's think briefly about bereavement. And there's a nice study, it's quite old now, by Linda Dowdney, where she reviewed a lot of the literature to find out how does bereavement, mainly parental bereavement, affect children, young people. And she looked at a lot of literature and had a really nice review of the sorts of reactions that you might expect. And what was interesting is that you don't really get a specific psychological problem. You get a broad range of lots of psychological difficulties. And what she found based on the research was that about a fifth of children, it would be clinically significant even a year later. So if we think about a few weeks, a few months, and they'll be doing fine, well, actually, a year later, a fifth of children will still be struggling significantly. One of the common themes that came from the literature was that how well the child does is closely related to how well their carer is doing. So if it's one parent that's died, how well is the other parent doing? And there's things that we can do to support the carers. Many of you will be familiar with this model of grieving. It's called the dual processing model of grief. One of the things I like about this model is it's based not on what some academics thought might be going on, but actually on diaries initially from adults who had been bereaved. They were just making a note of how they were doing. And then that was the basis of this model to begin with. And what it says is, rather than working your way through different stages of grief and then coming out the bottom and everything's fine, what happens if people will spend some time in what they call the loss-oriented mode? So they might be thinking about the grief might be intruding, they might be struggling to sort of say goodbye, they might be denying the fact that there's life decisions they need to be getting on with, really immersed in their grief. And then they spend some time in this, what they call restoration-oriented, where actually you're making changes to your life. You're starting to do other things. You might be cleaning out the bedroom of the person that died. You're developing new relationships. But that's not the end of the story, because then you dip back into the loss-oriented work. And then you sort of flip-flop from these two different ways of being. And if we're working with a family and you have different family members doing different things at different times, that can cause real conflict unless we help them to understand this. And then they can see, oh, you're doing that today, but I'm doing that. And that's okay. It gives people permission to do these different things. My mother died about 9 years ago. And on the second anniversary, my dad was really, really sad. He was really struggling. And he said the worst thing was that he felt like he'd gone backwards. And that then really upset him. He didn't feel like he was progressing through his grief. And I reminded him of this dual processing model. I said, come on, Dad, don't you remember? I told you about this. All you're doing is that anniversary has triggered a bit of this loss-oriented work. Of course it has. That's okay. So in fact, dipping in and out of the grief is part of the moving forward. So this manages people's expectations. And again, many of you will be familiar with Tonkin's model of grief, which Tonkin was a grief counselor, and this was a mother told this story of when her child died. This was her life after the bereavement, is one big black hole. And people said to her, oh, you know, time is a great healer. You know, with time, you'll learn to live with this. So she expected the grief to get smaller and for her to get her life back. But that isn't what happened. She said what actually happened was the grief stayed exactly the same time. But eventually, with time and support and patience, she started to build her life around her grief. And this isn't true for everyone, but what I like about this is it gives people permission to both hold on to their grief and to do other things as well. So they don't have to feel guilty about developing new interests, having new relationships, and they also don't have to feel that there's something pathological about holding on to some of their grief. There's a nice quote, I think, from Freud, a letter he wrote quite near the end of his life. I'm going to read this quote out. My daughter, who died, would have been 36 years old today. Although we know that after such loss, the acute state of mourning will subside, we also know we shall remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what may fill the gap, even if it be filled completely, it nevertheless remains something else. And actually, this is how it should be. It is the only way of perpetuating that love which we do not want to relinquish. Now, Freud wrote this in a letter, not in a textbook. And again, it sort of gives people permission to hold on to their grief whilst also moving on with other things. So just before we think about what happens when the trauma and the grief collide, if we were doing this in a workshop, if we had more time, I would get you to think about what sorts of things help, particularly children and young people following a bereavement, what helps them to adjust. And this is a list of things that might be helpful based on a number of randomized controlled trials. What are the common elements of different effective interventions? And these are the things that seem to be useful. The opportunity to say goodbye. If not able to do that in advance, finding a way to do it afterwards, perhaps in a creative, abstract way, perhaps. Feeling safe and stable, having knowledge and information about how they died and what happened, and also having knowledge and information about how grief works. The opportunity to express emotions rather than having to suppress them. Having a good attachment, having social support, all these things seem to be really helpful. Making sense of the death and developing a continuing bond. So again, if I just briefly talk about my mother, the meaning that I made of that event, you know, she was getting on a bit, she was not in the best of health, and she died so suddenly, she didn't even know she was dying. Her last words to the paramedic were, and this is so typical of my mum, I'm not having a heart attack, and I don't want to go to Kingston Hospital, I want to go to Epsom Hospital. And then she was gone. So she had no idea that she was dying. So for me, who wasn't present, that is a great meaning making to make of that event. For my dad, who was there, in fact, that was an incredibly traumatic event for him. So when I talked about the meaning for trauma, that becomes crucial for trauma and bereavement as well. So what happens when you bring these two things together when it's not just a bereavement, but it's a traumatic bereavement? So you have the impact of the bereavement, but you also have the impact of the trauma, but then they interact. So the traumatic quality, the nature of the death obstructs the grieving process, because lots of those things I've just mentioned will be either compromised or perhaps even missing if it's a traumatic death. It might be rather than being able to bring the person to mind and tell stories of their life and be sad, but actually enjoy the fact that you had them, you try to remember their life. And many of you in your grief work, I've seen that many of you are grief counselors, will be trying to help the person develop that continuing bond. But what happens is, if when you try to ask them about the person's life and their nice memories, actually what comes to mind is the memory of their death and the traumatic memory. So what happens if they're too scared to be sad, or if they feel that it's their fault in some way and they just get engrossed in their own guilt, or if they're too angry. I worked with one boy who was so angry about the fact his dad had died, he was busy planning his revenge on the person who was held responsible. And as far as he was concerned, when that person came out of prison, he was going to kill him. And we couldn't start doing the grief work because he was just completely obsessed with this. So we had to help him to process the nature of the death, the traumatic nature of the death, so that he could start the grieving of the loss. And I just wanted to say something about what makes a traumatic death. And I'll just go back to that slide from the meta-analysis, where actually it's about what the person makes of the event that's important. This was, I think, an interesting study where they compared children who had a parent die. Half of them, or not quite half, but a group of them, the parent had died suddenly and violently. The other half, the parent had died from an expected, they were ill and they were expected to die. And they used two measures. One, the UCLA PTSD Reaction Index, which is a measure of PTSD. And the other one, an extended grief inventory, which is a measure of complicated or traumatic grief. And you might expect that those whose parents had died suddenly and violently would have a higher score, but they didn't. It's almost exactly the same for both of them. So even natural, whatever that might mean, or expected deaths can sometimes be traumatic. Maybe there's a build-up, maybe they saw some resuscitations, maybe even if you tell someone that someone's going to die, actually that's difficult to really get your head around, and you hold on to a bit of hope. So it still comes as a shock. That's the same, just a different slide. So those things that I said were helpful, and as I've said, if we were doing this as a workshop, I would have your list of ideas, and then we'd think about how the traumatic nature of a death might compromise or even just take these things away. Many traumatic deaths may be sudden or unexpected, or as Anand said earlier, we had many restrictions that might have stopped us from saying goodbye over the last couple of years. Maybe there isn't a body, so maybe you're unable to have a funeral and say goodbye properly, or maybe you're unable to see the body because it's severely disfigured and that becomes impossible, or you're persuaded not to do that. I mean, almost by definition, a traumatic nature sort of rocks your view of things as safe enough. So that's going to put you on a sort of an unsteady footing to do your grieving from. Often with traumatic deaths, the information might be missing or absent or withheld. And in fact, what you may have is spectacular media accounts. The nature of media is that they're not very often interested in the coherent narrative. What they want is the most amazing bits of any story. And children, young people will inevitably at some point come across those. Even very young children, because those media accounts will still be there on the internet in years to come, they will come across them. A journalist once said to me, well, David, he said, you and I, we've basically got the same job, haven't we? I said, really? I said, how do you work that out? He said, we're both trying to help families to tell their stories. I said, yeah, that is true, but for opposite reasons. You're trying to get people to tell their stories to make them as big and spectacular as possible. I'm trying to get them to tell their stories so that they can put them behind them. Following death, many people would expect to feel very sad, and the people around the young person might help them with feeling sad. But what if they are really angry, or if they're really scared? Are we as good at managing and helping them with those sorts of feelings? Social support is a really interesting one, because again, I don't want to talk about all my bereavements, but when my nan died, 93, she died in her sleep, having spent the last day of her life with her grandchildren. In a way, it's a very natural and sad, but it's a very natural event. And we have a language for talking about those, and the community, your friends, your family sort of lean in to support you and help you, and suddenly lasagnas were being left on the doorstep, all those things, those sorts of deaths will often bring people in. When it's a traumatic death, particularly something like suicide, actually people might be so worried they might say the wrong thing. Well, I don't want to make it worse. So actually they back off. I've worked with many families who have said that previously people that would have been there for them actually avoided them or crossed the road to avoid them, so that because they didn't want to make it worse, they didn't want to say the wrong thing. Meaning making, I've said, is important, but almost by definition, traumatic deaths lead to difficulties in meaning making. And again, as I've said, it's difficult to hold on to that person's life and develop that continuing bond if actually the memory that comes to mind every time is the way that they died. So how can we help? How can we help people who have experienced traumatic deaths where the nature of the death is getting in the way of them grieving their loss? Well, we can provide the best possible environment for recovery from the trauma. This may seem a bit simplistic, but I think I find it helpful. Some people following potentially traumatic events and traumatic deaths will seem pretty unaffected. They kind of sail through and doesn't seem to be a problem. Some will develop a delayed response. Some will find it really difficult and continue to find it difficult. And some will recover. Some will find it difficult to begin with. And a big chunk of young people start off being very distressed. And then over time, they recover. And to me, the question is, what can we do to maximize their chances of recovery? What environment can we build around them so that they are most likely to spontaneously heal? Well, we're very lucky. And if you forget everything else I've said, this is the slide to remember. Stephen Hobfall and colleagues got, I think it's 20 different authors, some of whom disagree with each other, some of whom don't even like each other, but somehow he got them all to agree to these 5 principles. We're never going to have really good, high quality research because following traumatic events, actually, there's some ethical problems doing a good randomized controlled trial, particularly if we're thinking about children. But based on the evidence that is there, based on our best understanding of trauma and bereavement, what do we know about what will elicit the best chance of recovery? And there are 5 principles. And what I love about these principles is that they're completely sensible. None of them are sort of surprising. And it's not a prescription. It doesn't say day 3 do this, on week 7 do that. What it says is when you think about creating that environment for recovery from trauma or from traumatic bereavement, think about these 5 principles. I'm just going to go through these in a bit more detail, and then it would be great to see if there's any questions. First one is a sense of safety. So pretty much by definition, or very often, a traumatic event, a traumatic bereavement will shatter that person's belief that they are safe enough. So how can we help them to refine that sense of safety, making sure that their basic needs are met first? Re-establishing routines and familiarity. So school is a great environment for that because it's predictable and it's familiar, and that's how people feel safe. Can we minimize exposure to further trauma? And if we're thinking about traumatic bereavement, what are they accessing on their phones? What social media accounts, if it's a high profile event, are they accessing? Do we need to find a way perhaps to stop them doing that, or at least to discuss it with them and help them to understand why people who are not directly affected like to tell these big stories? Can we maximize the consistency? And can we, as those around the traumatically bereaved children, young people, be calm and compassionate and curious? And we might want to talk about what happened. The young person may well want to talk about it, but we want them to process it so they can realize what happened there so that they know that things are safe. And sometimes what happens is people are worried they might make it worse, so they don't talk about it. They don't give them enough information. And if we don't explain why that event happened, it's very easy for the young person to fill in the gaps. Some of them have very vivid imaginations. It's very easy to weave in the idea that it was their fault in some way. And then it's easy to overgeneralize. I worked with one girl who was not told anything about why the planes flew into the World Trade Center. And then she lived near Heathrow Airport in a high-rise block of flats. and no one had told her why those planes flew into that building, and therefore she didn't know that these planes were not going to fly into her building. So we need to give them enough information. Otherwise, they'll find, as they're searching information, they'll get it from a more sensational source. We want to make it talkable about so that they can process things realistically and helpfully. Then a sense of calm. I've talked about how sometimes following traumatic events, people are on this higher level of arousal. Well, how can we help them to recognize that and to bring their arousal level down? And that's going to be different for different people. Teachers, again, are just brilliant at doing this. They do this all day, every day already. You know, they have to get those enough of the children in that kind of zone where they're not over aroused and they're not asleep either. Different children need different things. Some will need to run around, some will need to read a book, some will listen to music. What can they do to regulate their emotions? And then a sense of connection. People sometimes feel isolated. We saw that isolation and social withdrawal are risk factors for PTSD. How can we help them to access support? One of the great things about bereavement services, if you work in groups, is you may be bringing together children, young people that have all experienced a bereavement. They may be different, but they will have experienced something similar. And that can be incredibly reassuring to young people. They may think they're the only ones who've ever been through something like this. And then they come to a group and they go, okay, so everyone in this room has been through something similar. And then a sense of control. I mean, in fact, the research talks about a sense of self-efficacy where you have a confidence that you can make decisions about what's going on around you that will benefit you. And one of the problems with traumatic events is that you feel like the rug's been pulled out from under your feet. Suddenly, the whole world seems unpredictable and you've got no control over anything. Well, how can we help young people to feel there are some things they have control over? How we can collaborate with them. So it's not that we need to do something to them or for them, but actually that they can do things for themselves, perhaps with our support or the support from others around them. And how do we help them to develop a sense of hope about the future? Sometimes traumatic events take that sense away. We don't want to diminish or dismiss their views of their past, but we do want to help to weave into their thinking a few thoughts about how you're going to survive this, what's going to happen in the future, what can you do going forwards. So we want to weave in some ideas about the future, maybe help them to identify the skills and the strengths that they have already. So if we combine some of these different principles now, if I was trying to help a person to regulate their emotions because they were just all over the place all the time, I might say, well, what have you already done? What do you do normally to relax? How do you end up falling asleep? What is it? What are the strategies that you already have? Rather than me come along and tell them what they can do. I might have some other ideas that I try out with them, but my first step will be, well, what skills have you already got? How are you going to take things forward? So overall, as a sort of a summary, what helps for some children, young people and families are really struggling. They might not make it to therapy for various reasons, but it doesn't have to be therapy with a therapist to be therapeutic. There are things that all of us can do, whatever our role is in young people's lives. One of the things we can do is stop and think about whether this might be a traumatic death. It might not be a sudden and violent one, but actually for that young person, is it traumatic? I worked with one girl, she was 7 years old. Her granny had died very peacefully in her sleep, and everyone was saying, oh, it was a good death, a natural death. But this 7-year-old, people die, she said. My parents are going to die, I'm going to die. For her, it was incredibly traumatic. She became incredibly clingy, understandably, to her mother, and people thought she would just get over it. But actually, no one really gave her the time to make sense of things, to think things through. I think it's useful to normalize and validate reactions. So rather than to pathologize things, actually say, yeah, of course you're angry. Of course you're sad. Of course you're these things. That makes sense. And yeah, sometimes you're happy, and that's okay. There's a wonderful film from Winston's Wish, some of you may have seen, called Puddle Jumping. It's a short animation on their website. And it just describes how children jump into a puddle and then they jump out. And sometimes as adults, we struggle to keep up with them. So they might be really sad and we're talking to them about their loss. And next minute they're off playing football and we're going, what happened? Is it all okay now? And then just like the dual processing model, they jump back in to the puddle. and that's normal. So we can reassure everyone that that's normal. Can we help them to cope with and get through intense emotions? Can we ensure they have opportunities to process the event of the death? So we're not making them talk about it, whether they like it or not, but neither are we avoiding it and saying, no, I don't want to hear about that. Are we giving them the opportunities to think things through as and when they're ready to do so? Are we giving them opportunities to make useful sense of it, not just to process the memory, but also to develop useful but truthful meaning of the event? Sometimes that needs adults around the children, young people, to help them to talk about it and to think about it, and not to donate our views and not to say, oh yes, but just to help them to come to their own conclusions about things. And are we making sure that we are giving them opportunities to not be alone, to be with other people if that's what they want? Sometimes going through traumatic bereavement can be really tough, but they don't have to do it on their own. You know, there are people that can be with them on that journey. And another thing that helps, I think, is making sure that those around the bereaved make sure that they are in the best possible shape to help them. And that's you I'm talking about. You know, all of you who are there trying to help children, young people who've been through traumatic bereavement, I want to really encourage you to look after yourself, to stop and think, well, how is this affecting me? You know, there's opportunities to reflect and be reflective practice, and to think through the way that these events have affected them. I think that's really important. A bit of self-care, a bit of making sure your team is supportive. I think sometimes we're not very good at looking after ourselves. And I've worked with a number of colleagues who are really good at telling the parents to look after themselves so they can look after the children, and they're not listening to themselves. So I really want to encourage you to make sure you are looking after yourselves so that you can continue to look after the children and young people. If you want to know more about this idea of creating the environment around a young person, then there's a book coming out in a couple of weeks, which you may be interested in. And finally, just to go back where I started, really thinking about the UK Trauma Council and our resources around traumatic bereavement. As I've said, we have an animation, a guide for schools, short guide for practitioners as well. And we do offer a bit of training. The current training from the website, I just checked before we came on, is all full, but I will make sure, sorry, it's not awful, it's all full. But I'll make sure that we have some more dates put up in the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to have a discussion or answer any questions if that's useful.
Thank you, David, for a truly outstanding presentation, more than even my, what you thought, rather grandiose introduction. And I think all of us have learned an enormous amount from this presentation. We'll want to think about it. And it's wonderful that the recording of this session will be available to all participants, and the slides, so that will really help us to work through and think about them. There have been some really very interesting points raised, and it may be that some of them may need to be answered a bit later if we, because we've got limited time. The last question came up, and I thought was fascinating, which was any advice for working with children and young people with neurodevelopmental problems and learning developmental difficulties. And I know, having just looked at the literature recently, that the whole business of adapting approaches to meet the needs of children and young people with intellectual disability and neurodevelopmental autistic syndromes is a very important issue.
Yes, absolutely. I think a good therapist always adapts what they've got to the person in front of them, regardless of what diagnoses or what descriptions there might be about them. But I think some people just see the world in a different way or experience emotions in a different way, and it can be particularly difficult. A colleague of mine would say that autistic children are traumatized by everyday life because of the way that they see things. I think I have two bits of advice, and they're sort of signposting to other things, so I hope that's okay. One is there's an author in the States called Dan Hoover, And he recently published a research article, which was really a review of the literature around autism, trauma, and PTSD. I think it's a good review. If I'm supervising master's students, I will often use it as a good example of a literature review. He really brings everything together. Now, he would say, based on the research, the trouble with children with social communication difficulties more broadly is that, first of all, they are a bit more likely to be traumatized in the first place than other children. They're a bit more vulnerable. They're a bit more, so they experience more of those potentially traumatic events. They make sense of them in a way which they're more likely to be traumatized by them. They're less likely to be open and honest, or to be upfront about their difficulties. So they tend to underreport on symptoms, which means we then rely on those around them who may miss or misconstrue their symptoms. And then even if they do jump through all those hurdles and end up seeing someone for some help, a lot of what we do relies on a relationship or relies on a certain way of thinking, and it can be really difficult. So it's a real kind of multi-layered complexity, but I think his review is really helpful. And there's also, if you just Google Pookie, or what's her name, Knightsmith or Kingsmith, someone will remember, I'm sure, in a moment, or I'll look it up. She does a lot of work with autistic children. Knightsmith, thank you. And she's got some amazing resources on her website. She's very generous with her resources, and they're real, really practical tips for how to work with children with differences. So I would encourage those two things.
Thank you very much. That's really most helpful. Another interesting question which came up is, how do we locate the work with trauma and bereavement in the general context of the concerns with ACEs, the concerns with adversity? How do we locate them, given the tremendous interest in this, the whole field of adversity and ACEs and so on?
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? I think the wonderful thing about this, the relatively recent interest in ACEs, is that it has really made the point incredibly convincingly that actually adverse experiences have a far-reaching and significant impact on individuals. And because of the large data sets that have been used, it's incredible, that research, I think. However, I think trauma, some of the events on the adverse childhood experiences list, some of them are not necessarily traumatic for some people. And I think I would see our work to be much more specific to thinking about events that were overwhelming, have overwhelmed a person's capacity to cope, leading to negative impact on an individual level. For me, one of the worries about ACEs as a framework is I'm not sure how helpful it is for me in my individual work with young people. Am I worried about what their ACEs score is? No, I'm worried about what are the events that they're telling me about that have had a particular impact on them. So I think ACEs has been a fantastic body of research, but we need to think carefully about what that means for us working with individuals and how those particular events have affected that particular person.
Yeah, thanks. I very agree with that, because in a sense, the ACEs is a risk index, looking at the experiences that adults have, and when you look at it, what's actually happening here and now, it doesn't always quite work out the same. So I think we're together with that. Thank you very much. Another question which came up, which is, a colleague working with you asked, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children know about the loss, know about death in their families at home, but they don't have any details. They don't have any real knowledge about what's happened. And how can one help young people in that context of such significant uncertainty and unknowingness, really?
Yeah, I think that's a particular challenge. I do think those 5 principles become even more important then, because actually, there are ways they might be able to find out a bit more. Sometimes the Red Cross are really helpful in actually finding out what it is that's happened to young people's families. But that's not always going to be the case, and they may have to tolerate that unknowing. And I think not only have they experienced trauma, then they've also got this, well, what is it I'm trying to get my head around? Because I don't actually know. And then I think those 5 principles become even more important. And then just being open about the fact that we may not know what's happened. And living with that uncertainty, I think, can sometimes be really challenging, but that might be the role or the task, rather than trying to help them process a trauma if they don't actually know what it is they're processing. So I think focusing on those 5 principles becomes even more important.
Thanks very much. Another interesting question from Jeffrey Robinson, who asks about something which you may appreciate. I don't quite know quite what he means, but you may do, is in creating a trauma narrative, so important as we know in the whole field of processing, how do you manage overwhelming traumatic events? And something which he talks about is the default mode network, DMN. I'm not sure whether you're aware of what that's about.
No, I'm not, but it sounds as if it might be that when you trigger that traumatic event, albeit in therapy, that actually the brain is very used now, their default mode is to respond in that particular way. So I imagine that's what it is about. And I think one of the things we see certainly in PTSD is that the memory intrudes, it triggers this response, and they push it away. And what happens is this just happens time and time again. And what we do in therapy eventually, and that's an important word, I think, is we enable them to perhaps gradually, to first of all be able to regulate their emotions enough to start to let the trauma in and start to do it in a controlled way. So rather than it have a mind of its own and comes to you when you're asleep and it's dark and you're on your own, actually what we're going to do it in this session when the lights are on, and you can stop it at any moment. You have control over it here, and you've got control over your emotions because we've developed some of those skills to be able to do that. And we might think about the worst one first, or if you want, we'll think about one of the other traumas first, and we'll work our way in. But for me, when I'm doing trauma-focused work, giving control to the young person is absolutely crucial. They need to be in charge of it. It can't be me telling them what to do or making them do it. It has to come from them being prepared and enabled to do it. I mean, no one's going to ever want to do that piece of work, but my job is to help them weigh up the pros and the cons compared to their current symptoms. Would they rather think about it with me here, where they can be in control of it, or when they're in bed and it's dark and they're on their own?
Thanks very much. I think that's interesting. Another question which has just come in, which I think is interesting. Could you say something about dealing with young people with complex PTSD when the triggers might still be present, exacerbating anxiety? And would EMDR be a helpful approach? And I think it's interesting because I think there's some feeling that these two approaches, the immediacy of EMDR and the development of a trauma narrative, are really very much, in my mind, very complementary, actually.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so complex PTSD was part of ICD-11 that just came out a few years ago, where you have those PTSD symptoms plus some additional problems. So you have intrusions, arousal, and avoidance, plus difficulties with relationships, difficulties managing your emotions, so you may dissociate or lose your temper, and difficulties with your self-concept, thinking that you're defeated or worthless. So it's kind of PTSD plus. And first of all, I think it's worth saying, I think it's a useful diagnosis because it says that these reactions that you're experiencing are because of what happened to you, very often because of what someone else did to you. So I think it can be a very normalizing and destigmatizing diagnosis to have. And at the moment, the evidence is still in its infancy because it was actually only came out just a few years ago. I think EMDR certainly has a role to play. With children and young people, we have much less evidence for EMDR than we do for trauma-focused CBT. I'm sure that in years to come, there'll be equivalent. But Anand, I think you're quite right. They are very, I see EMDR, I do EMDR sometimes, is very similar to my other approach, which is trauma-focused CBT. Both of them involve deliberately bringing to mind these memories that are falling into your consciousness, deliberately stopping and thinking and reflecting upon how does it make you feel, where in your body do you feel that, what's the thought that goes with that, what actually would be a more useful thought. To me, that it's very similar. Both of them involve deliberately thinking through what happened within the safe space of therapy, rather than it doing it of its own volition.
Thank you very much. I totally agree with that. Very helpful. And another very interesting question which came up from an attendee who wished to remain anonymous. Working with children and young people with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it strikes our colleague that the approaches discussed may suit supporting them with coping with their own diagnosis and the ongoing losses they experience, including, of course, their loss in terms of their own shortness of life. So interesting point to bring up.
Yeah, absolutely. I work with some psychologists at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge who are often working with children with life-limiting difficulties, and they find those 5 principles incredibly useful as a framework, working with families and young people. So yeah, that's a great comment.
Yes. Thank you very much. And another question, which is which was multiple experiences versus single, because in a sense, some of the traumatic bereavement may very well be single events, but it might occur in the context of individuals such as the US children, unaccompanied children, who may have had significant numbers of other highly stressful events as well. And I wonder if you'd like to talk about the spectrum which may occur for some children and young people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting because sometimes we think of a particular event being the trauma, it's this discrete event, that was a traumatic event. But actually, when we take the time to listen to the young people, we find that, that might have been part of it, but it might not have been the whole story. And their previous events might color the way they see this one event, if you like, the index trauma. And even when we start to think about the index trauma, the bit we think might have been worse might not have been the worst bit. I've worked with a number of children, young people, where everyone has assumed a particular event was the trauma, but actually it wasn't. It was something else. And when you listen carefully, that's when you get to hear what is the real trauma. There's one boy who was really, really badly assaulted, and everyone assumed that was the worst bit. But actually, when he trusted me enough, and when I listened carefully, the worst bit was a few days later, hearing some other people talk about the assault. And he suddenly realized that the people he thought were his friends had not come to his aid. And to him, that was a traumatic event. And then it had all sorts of ripples, because suddenly he's thinking, maybe I'm not a good judge of character. So then he thought, I better just not make relationships. I'm obviously no good at choosing who's a good friend. And he became incredibly isolated and lonely and then depressed. So I think when we think about this complexity of multiple events, to me, it takes a long time, sometimes a lot of trust, before we can really start to untangle things and work out from the young person's point of view, where does the trauma really lie? And the important thing for me, I think, is to not make assumptions about that, but to listen carefully.
And the final question, which I think is unanswerable, which is a good place to stop, is one of our colleagues, Kate Hodgson, says she's working with a child who is announcing in the classroom that her mother died. Staff are struggling how to respond. And the second alternative to that is a child who won't engage with any professionals, won't engage with school, and can be very dysregulated at home. So talking too much or too little. Sorry, I've given you very little time, but you might as well start on a high point.
Well, you said that the best place to stop is with an unanswerable. For me, the best place to stop would have been just before the unanswerable questions. But it's, I think it's really interesting. Young children are very disinhibited. Understandably, that's their nature. And so sometimes the problem isn't avoidance, is that they're talking to everyone. and it ends up being unhelpful. So I think it's important in that case to help the young person to think about, well, who are we going to tell these stories to? Who are the allies? Where's it going to be useful? We don't want to give the message that you can't talk about it, you shouldn't talk about it, because then they become avoidant and that becomes unhelpful. But actually helping them to be a little bit more careful about where they share the story. The fact that this person is willing and able to share the story is fantastic. We want to build on that lack of avoidance, but perhaps just direct it a little bit. And the other one, the person who doesn't want the help but is causing significant problems. For me, I think all that we can do there is be patient and present and just wait, and to keep making sure the offer remains open, and to just find someone in that child's life who can start to have some of those conversations. It might be the lunchtime supervisor, it might be their teacher, it might be a therapist, who knows? But just being really patient and kind and compassionate. The problem is that sort of behavior often makes it difficult to be kind, patient, and compassionate.
Right. Thank you, David, so much. Compassionate schools is a wonderful place to stop. So thank you very much from everyone. And I'm sure we'll very much look forward to being able to really think about your presentation through the recording and the slides. So thanks very much. And thanks everybody who's contributed to the questions. Sorry, not been able to answer everyone, but I hope we've managed to respond and to really help you think about these important issues. Thank you so much.
Find out more about becoming an ACAM member and to be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health. Visit www.acamh.org.